December 17th, 1941. The smoke over Pearl Harbor has finally cleared, revealing a graveyard of American steel. The United States Navy is a broken machine. Admiral Husband Kimmel has been stripped of his command in total disgrace. The Pacific Fleet is leaderless, paralyzed by the shock of the Japanese surprise attack. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt is looking for a savior. He doesn't want a shouter. He doesn't want a man who will seek immediate, reckless glory. He needs a man who can rebuild a navy from the bottom of the ocean. He looks past the famous names and the aggressive heroes. He looks past 28 senior officers who are next in line for the job. He chooses a quiet, white-haired man who spends his days behind a desk in the Bureau of Navigation. His name is Chester Nimitz. No one in the press expected him. The Japanese high command had barely heard of him. But Roosevelt knew that the war in the Pacific would be won by logistics, patience, and cold math. The man who understood the human engine was about to take command of the most desperate theater of the war. The smoke over Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941, was thick enough to taste. It carried the acrid scent of burning bunker fuel and charred teakwood. The Pacific Fleet was no longer a weapon. It was a collection of casualties. Admiral Husband Kimmel stood on the shore, watching the lifeblood of his command leak into the oily water. The USS Arizona was a shattered tomb, its forward magazines having detonated with the force of a small earthquake. The USS Oklahoma had capsized entirely, its hull looking like the back of a dead whale in the harbor. The USS West Virginia and USS California were settled into the mud of the lagoon. Every battleship in the Pacific Fleet had been either sunk or severely damaged in less than 2 hours. The technical backbone of American naval power had been snapped by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Kimmel was a man of discipline and detail, but he was now a commander without a fleet. The news reached Washington, D.C. with the speed of a lightning strike. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat in the Oval Office, surrounded by maps and grim advisors. He knew the American public would demand a sacrifice for this humiliation. Kimmel was officially relieved of his command on December 17, 1941. He was stripped of his 4-star rank and reverted to a 2-star rear admiral. The vacancy at the top of the Pacific Fleet was the most dangerous opening in American history. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox immediately flew to Hawaii to survey the wreckage. He found a naval staff that was shell-shocked and paralyzed by the magnitude of the loss. The technical reports were staggering. Thousands of sailors were dead, and the dry docks were clogged with debris. However, Knox noticed one thing that the Japanese had missed in their raid: the massive fuel farm, containing 4.5 million barrels of oil, remained untouched. The submarine base and the repair shops were also largely intact. Pearl Harbor was a graveyard of ships, but it was still a functioning industrial base. Roosevelt needed a man who could see past the sunken steel and focus on those machine shops. He didn't need a sea dog who would charge blindly into a revenge mission. He needed a strategist who understood that the coming war would be won by logistics and engineering. In the 1940s, the U.S. Navy was governed by a rigid system of seniority. There were 28 officers more senior than Chester Nimitz on the active list. To skip over them was to violate every tradition of the old boy network in Annapolis. But Roosevelt was a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy and knew the personnel files intimately. He looked toward the Bureau of Navigation, the department responsible for every man's assignment. Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz was the chief of that bureau. Nimitz was not a headline grabber. He was a man of quiet, clockwork precision. He spent his days analyzing the psychological and technical profiles of every officer in the service. He knew who was a drunk, who was a coward, and who was a brilliant tactician. Nimitz understood the human engine of the Navy better than anyone else in Washington. Roosevelt summoned Nimitz to a private meeting at the White House. He observed Nimitz's calm demeanor and his shock of white hair. Nimitz didn't beg for the job. In fact, he had previously turned it down months earlier. He felt that jumping over his seniors would create resentment and friction. Roosevelt didn't care about the feelings of the old guard. "Tell Nimitz to get out to Pearl Harbor and stay there until the war is won," Roosevelt told Knox. The appointment was a technical shock to the system. Nimitz was promoted to the rank of admiral, bypassing the 28 men above him. He was now the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, CINC, PAC. His mission was not just to fight the Japanese. It was to rebuild the very concept of naval warfare. He was a diesel engine expert by training, having studied the mechanics of submarines. He viewed the Navy as a massive machine that had been improperly maintained. He packed a single suitcase and prepared to depart for the islands in secret. He traveled across the United States in civilian clothes, using the alias Mr. Freeman. He spent the long train ride studying the technical specs of the surviving cruisers and destroyers. He knew that the age of the battleship was over, though few of his peers would admit it. The future of the war lay with the aircraft carriers and the silent service of submarines. Nimitz arrived in Hawaii on Christmas Eve, landing in a PBY Catalina flying boat. The harbor was still gray and smelled of death. He looked at the ruins of Battleship Row and didn't see a defeat. He saw a clean slate for a new kind of war. The bureau man was about to prove that a calm mind is the most lethal weapon in the arsenal. The smoldering ruin was the forge where Nimitz would hammer out the victory. He walked onto the pier, ready to face a staff that expected a purge. But Nimitz was not there to fire men. He was there to fix the machine. In the rigid hierarchy of the 1941 United States Navy, seniority was the ultimate law of the land. The line of succession for major commands was based almost entirely on a man's graduation date from Annapolis. When the vacancy for the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, CINC-PAC opened, the Navy Board expected a traditional promotion. They looked at the annual register of the commissioned and warrant officers, a book that dictated the naval pecking order. Chester Nimitz was a rear admiral, but he was far down the list of eligible candidates for the 4-star post. Specifically, there were exactly 28 officers who stood between Nimitz and the top of the list. These were the old guard of the battleship Navy, most having served since the late 19th century. Many of them were decorated veterans of the Spanish-American War and the First World War. Admirals like Thomas C. Hart, commander of the Asiatic Fleet, were considered the natural heirs to the Pacific throne. Hart was a man of immense experience and legendary aggression, perfectly fitting the mold of a warrior. Others, like Admiral Roy E. Ingersoll, were respected for their administrative brilliance and deep ties to the Pentagon. To skip over these men was not just a breach of etiquette. It was a technical earthquake within the department. In the 1940s, a junior officer jumping a senior officer was often met with mass resignations in protest. It was widely believed that such a move would destroy the morale of the entire officer corps. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was fully aware of these technical and social risks. He had served as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the Great War and understood the Navy mind. He knew that the 28 men above Nimitz were highly competent at fighting a traditional war. They were masters of the big gun doctrine, focusing on the heavy armor of the battleship line. But Pearl Harbor had effectively deleted the American battleship line from the strategic equation. Roosevelt realized that the coming war would be a carrier and submarine war, something entirely new. He needed a commander who wasn't emotionally or professionally wedded to the old ways of thinking. He reviewed the service records of every man on the list of 28. He found that many of them were nearing retirement age or had health issues that would not survive the Pacific heat. More importantly, many of them were shouters, men who led by intimidation and loud demands. Roosevelt was looking for a quiet professional who could handle the intense psychological pressure of a retreat. He needed a man who could sustain a holding action for 6 months while American factories ramped up. The list of 28 was filled with heroes, but Roosevelt saw them as men of the past. Nimitz, by contrast, had spent years in the Bureau of Navigation, which was the Navy's personnel hub. He had processed the efficiency reports and personality assessments of every man on that seniority list. Nimitz knew the strengths and, more crucially, the hidden weaknesses of those 28 superiors. He knew who was prone to panic under pressure and who lacked the technical imagination for carrier warfare. Roosevelt recognized that Nimitz's desk job had actually been the ultimate training ground for high command. When Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox presented the traditional list, Roosevelt pushed it aside. He specifically asked for Nimitz, a man who was then ranked as a lowly 2-star rear admiral. The move was so controversial that the Navy Department initially tried to talk the president out of it. They urged that the 28 seniors would feel humiliated and refuse to serve under a junior. Roosevelt remained unmoved, stating that the crisis at Pearl Harbor required a technical mind, not just a sea dog. Nimitz himself was hesitant when he heard the news of his selection. He possessed a deep respect for the traditions of the service and the men who had come before him. He was concerned that his presence would create a command friction that would help the Japanese. He expressed these concerns to his wife, Catherine, noting that he would be giving orders to his mentors. But the president's order was a direct commission that could not be refused in a time of war. The jump from Rear Admiral to 4-star Admiral was a technical promotion of 500% in terms of responsibility. It was the equivalent of a store manager being asked to run a global corporation overnight. The 28 bypassed officers were left in a state of professional shock. Some were quietly moved to administrative roles in Washington to avoid the shame of the jump. Others, like Admiral Hart, were left in their regional commands, but were now technically subordinate to Nimitz. Nimitz handled this transition with a level of grace that few other men could have mustered. He did not gloat. He did not arrive in Hawaii with a new broom to sweep away the old staff. He arrived with the humility of a man who knew he was a technical anomaly in the system. He realized that his authority wouldn't come from his stars, but from his performance. The list of 28 remained a shadow over his early months of command. Every decision he made was scrutinized by those he had bypassed. But Nimitz used his knowledge of personnel to win them over one by one. He proved that Roosevelt's choice wasn't based on favoritism, but on a cold assessment of the future. The junior admiral was about to outthink the Japanese Empire. The list of 28 had the seniority, but Nimitz had the vision. He understood that a fleet is only as strong as the technical data and the men who interpret it. By the time he reached Hawaii, the controversy of his promotion had begun to fade. It was replaced by the terrifying reality of the mission he had inherited. He was the 29th man on the list, but he was the first man in the president's mind. The Bureau of Navigation was the silent brain of the United States Navy. Despite its name, it had very little to do with charts or compasses. It was the central department for personnel, training, and assignments. In 1941, the Bureau was the most powerful administrative office in Washington. Chester Nimitz was the man in charge of this massive human machine. He sat at the center of a web made of paper, ink, and secrets. Every officer in the fleet had a file in Nimitz's office. These were known as fitness reports, or fit reps. They contained the raw, unvarnished truth about every man wearing a uniform. A captain might look heroic on the bridge of a battleship, but his fit rep might reveal a history of alcohol abuse or poor judgment. Nimitz read these reports with a level of focus that bordered on the obsessive. He did not just skim the surface of a man's career. He looked for the technical data of their character. He was the curator of the Navy's collective soul. This desk job was widely viewed by seagoing officers as a career dead end. In the 1940s, a true warrior was supposed to be on a deck, not behind a desk. The line officers often looked down on the bureau men in Washington. They saw them as bureaucrats who lived in a world of red tape and carbon copies. But Nimitz knew that the bureau was actually the ultimate high ground. He possessed a God's-eye view of the entire organization. He knew which commanders were innovators and which were relics of the past. He knew who understood the technical complexities of the new Mark 14 torpedo. He knew who had the mathematical mind required for the new radar systems. While other admirals were practicing gunnery drills, Nimitz was studying human performance. He viewed the Navy through the lens of a diesel engineer. Years earlier, he had traveled to Germany to study the mechanics of diesel engines. He had a deep, technical respect for how small parts made a large machine move. He applied the same engineering logic to the officer corps. If a gear was stripped, the entire engine would eventually seize. If a commander was brittle, the entire fleet would break under pressure. Nimitz's office in the main Navy building on Constitution Avenue was a library of files. He worked in a room filled with the hum of electric fans and the clatter of typewriters. He processed thousands of promotion requests and transfer orders every month. This gave him an incredible, near-photographic memory for names and faces. By the time the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Nimitz already had his short list. He didn't need to interview candidates for the new war. He already knew exactly who was capable of handling the coming storm. He knew the young Turks, the junior officers who were obsessed with aircraft carriers. He knew the black shoe traditionalists who would never give up their big guns. This technical knowledge of personnel was his greatest strategic asset. It allowed him to bypass the old boy network without causing a total collapse. He could spot a talented man hidden 3 ranks down in a minor department. He could identify a failure even if that man had a chest full of medals. Roosevelt chose Nimitz because he was the only man who knew where the talent was buried. The president didn't just want a leader. He wanted a master mechanic. Nimitz understood that the Navy wasn't just made of steel and oil. It was made of 300,000 distinct human components. He knew the tolerances of those components under extreme heat. The Bureau of Navigation was renamed the Bureau of Naval Personnel shortly after. But for Nimitz, the mission remained exactly the same. He was there to ensure the right man was in the right slot at the right time. He handled the selection boards with the precision of a watchmaker. He favored merit over seniority, which was a radical concept in 1941. He promoted men who had shown technical brilliance in the submarine service. Nimitz himself had been a submariner, a branch known for its technical isolation. Submariners lived in a world of valves, pressures, and silent calculations. This background gave Nimitz a unique, analytical perspective on leadership. He didn't lead through charisma or loud speeches. He led through the cold, accurate assessment of data. When he left the Bureau for Hawaii, he took that database with him in his head. He knew he was walking into a command structure that was broken, but he also knew exactly which parts he could reuse. The master of the Bureau was ready to rebuild the Pacific Fleet. He didn't need a new fleet. He needed a new way to use the men he had. The filing cabinets of Washington had prepared him for the chaos of the ocean. He was the only man who knew the secret history of the American Navy, and he was about to use that history to write a new future. The HR man was the only one who could fix the war. The meeting did not take place in a crowded boardroom. It occurred in the private, wood-paneled study of the White House. The air in the room was thick with the scent of Moroccan tobacco and old parchment. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat behind his cluttered desk. He was a man who loved the sea with a visceral passion. Roosevelt had served as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. He viewed himself as a Navy man first and a politician second. He understood the technical specifications of a destroyer as well as any captain. He also understood the toxic nature of naval politics. Across from him sat Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz was the picture of an understated professional. He wore his service blues with a crisp, geometric perfection. His hair was white. His eyes were a piercing level blue. Roosevelt watched him closely as he reviewed the latest damage reports from Hawaii. The president was looking for something specific in his next commander. He did not want a man who was prone to emotional outbursts. He did not want a man who would seek vengeance at the cost of his ships. He needed a man who was as calm as a frozen lake. Roosevelt knew that the next 6 months would be a series of retreats and losses. The Japanese Navy was a superior force in almost every technical category in late 1941. They had more carriers, better torpedoes, and more experienced pilots. The American commander would have to endure the humiliation of losing territory. He would have to preserve his remaining carriers like they were made of glass. Roosevelt asked Nimitz a direct question about the state of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz did not sugarcoat the reality of the situation. He spoke about the loss of the battleship line with clinical detachment. He focused on the technical survival of the fuel farms and the submarine base. He argued that the fleet's potential was still high if the repair shops were utilized. Roosevelt liked the way Nimitz thought about the machine of the Navy. The president then brought up the delicate issue of the seniority list. He mentioned the 28 officers who were technically ahead of Nimitz. Nimitz remained silent, respecting the traditional hierarchy of the service. He had actually turned down a similar promotion earlier in 1941. He had told the Secretary of the Navy that he did not want to jump his seniors. He feared the resentment it would cause among the higher ranks. But Roosevelt was no longer asking for Nimitz's opinion on the matter. The time for naval etiquette had ended with the first bomb at Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. He told Nimitz that the survival of the nation outweighed the feelings of 28 men. "I want you to take command of the Pacific Fleet," the president said. The room went silent as the weight of the command settled over them. Nimitz realized that he was being asked to lead a defeat into a victory. He knew that if he failed, his name would be synonymous with the fall of the Pacific. He also knew that he would be giving orders to his former mentors. He accepted the commission with a short, respectful nod. Roosevelt then gave him a final, famous instruction. "Tell Nimitz to get out to Pearl Harbor and stay there until the war is won." The president was giving Nimitz total, undisputed authority over the theater. He was granting him a blank check to rebuild the command as he saw fit. The meeting moved into the technical requirements for the transition. Nimitz requested a small, mobile staff that could move quickly. He did not want to arrive in Hawaii with a massive entourage from Washington. He wanted to evaluate the men already on the ground at Pearl Harbor. He believed that a purge of Kimmel's staff would be a technical error. He argued that these men had the most direct knowledge of the Japanese tactics. If he fired them, he would lose months of vital intelligence. Roosevelt agreed with this analytical approach to leadership. The president noted that Nimitz's background in diesel engineering was a major factor. He wanted a commander who could fix a broken engine, not just sail a ship. The war in the Pacific would be a war of vast distances and mechanical reliability. Every gallon of fuel and every spare part would have to be calculated. Nimitz was the only admiral who truly understood the logistics of a submarine war. The meeting ended with a firm handshake. Nimitz walked out of the White House and back into the cold December air. He was now the most powerful naval officer in the world. But he was also a man who had to travel in secret to his own command. The technical details of his departure were handled with extreme caution. He was ordered to use a pseudonym and travel in civilian clothes. He would be known as Mr. Freeman during his transit to the West Coast. This was done to prevent Japanese spies from identifying the new commander. The president's choice remained a secret to the public for several days. Nimitz spent those days in his office at the Bureau of Navigation. He cleared his desk of the paperwork that had defined his career. He looked at the files of the men he would soon be leading. He was looking for the mechanics of the new Navy. He was looking for the men who could adapt to the age of the aircraft carrier. The Roosevelt meeting had changed the course of the 20th century. It was the moment the U.S. Navy shifted from a traditional force to a modern machine. The president had chosen the engineer over the aristocrat. He had chosen the desk officer over the sea dog. Nimitz began his journey to the smoldering ruins of Hawaii. He carried the president's trust and a mind for technical perfection. The master of the Bureau was leaving the paper behind for the steel. He was going to find out if his calculations about human performance were correct. He was going to Pearl Harbor to stay, and he was going there to win. Chester Nimitz did not view the Pacific War through the lens of a romantic naval tradition. He approached the conflict as a massive, broken piece of machinery requiring a master mechanic. His unique strategic perspective was forged in the oily, high-pressure world of early submarines. In the early 1900s, the silent service was the most technical and dangerous branch of the Navy. Early submarines were temperamental collections of leaking valves, heavy batteries, and experimental engines. Nimitz became a specialist in the internal combustion engine during an era when most admirals still preferred coal and steam. The Navy recognized his technical aptitude and sent him to Germany in 1913 to study advanced power plants. He visited the MAN factories in Nuremberg and Augsburg to witness the birth of modern diesel technology. He stood on the factory floors, taking meticulous notes on tolerances, fuel injection, and thermal efficiency. He wasn't just observing a foreign industry. He was absorbing the philosophy of German precision engineering. When he returned to the United States, he was tasked with building the Navy's first large-scale diesel engine. He oversaw the construction of the power plants for the USS Maumee, a vital naval oiler. Nimitz did not supervise the project from a distant office or a polished quarterdeck. He spent his days in the New York Navy Yard, covered in grease, metal shavings, and lubricating oil. He worked directly with the machinists to translate complex German blueprints into American steel. This experience taught him that a fleet is only as effective as its preventative maintenance schedule. He realized that a single faulty gasket or a stripped gear could neutralize a 10,000-ton ship. Nimitz viewed the Pacific Fleet as a series of interconnected mechanical and logistical systems. He understood the mean time between failures for every major component of a cruiser or an aircraft carrier. This technical obsession with parts and logistics became his greatest strategic advantage in early 1942. While other commanders focused on the glory of a heavy broadside, Nimitz focused on the flow of spare parts. He knew that the vast, salt-sprayed distances of the Pacific would chew up engines and foul fuel lines. A ship stuck in a repair dock was a ship that was effectively removed from the war effort. Therefore, he viewed the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard as the most critical weapon in the entire theater. He considered the welders, pipe fitters, and electricians to be frontline troops in a war of industrial attrition. His engineering mind allowed him to calculate the fuel consumption of a task force to the last gallon. He knew exactly how many tankers were required to keep his carriers moving at a sustained combat speed. He also possessed a unique understanding of the technical limitations of American weaponry. He was one of the few senior officers who took the early, catastrophic failures of the Mark 14 torpedo seriously. He didn't blame the submarine crews for the misses. He looked for the mechanical flaw in the firing pin. His background in submarines gave him a natural affinity for hidden warfare and technical stealth. He believed in the cold power of verified data over the rigid tradition of the naval old guard. Roosevelt chose him because a maintenance man was needed to resurrect the Pacific Fleet from the mud. The president knew that Nimitz would not throw his remaining ships away in a fit of temper or pride. He would wait until the machinery of the Navy was tuned to a perfect, lethal, and sustainable pitch. Nimitz's mind functioned like a slide rule, constantly balancing tactical risk against technical capacity. By the time he reached Hawaii, he had already mapped out the industrial recovery of every surviving hull. He was ready to outfix, outmaintain, and outlast the Imperial Japanese Navy. The war was a machine, and Chester Nimitz was the only man who knew how to make it run. Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Eve in a PBY Catalina flying boat. The harbor still smelled of stagnant oil and the scent of electrical fires. The white-haired admiral stepped onto the pier to meet a staff paralyzed by guilt. Kimmel's men expected a total purge of the command structure. Usually a new commander fires everyone associated with a major defeat. But Nimitz announced he was keeping every single officer in place. This stabilized the morale of the fleet and prevented a secondary collapse. He told the staff they already knew the enemy better than any newcomers could. He focused the first 48 hours on the technical recovery of the sunken battleships. Raising and repairing ships locally allowed the fleet to be reborn faster. He prioritized the immediate repairs of the USS Yorktown and USS Enterprise. His no-fire policy kept intelligence officers like Joe Rocafort at their posts. Station Hypo began cracking the Japanese naval code JN-25 almost immediately. Nimitz trusted the codebreakers because he valued technical data over raw guesswork. He stood in the destruction and saw a clear path to a counterattack at Midway. The bureau man had moved from the filing cabinets to the Pacific Front line. He rebuilt the command through technical continuity and a legendary calm. By Christmas night, the Pacific Fleet had a new heart and a mechanical rhythm. The right man for the job was not the loudest, but the most precise. The selection of Chester Nimitz was a masterstroke of personnel management. FDR bypassed 28 seniors to find the perfect human engine for the task. Nimitz proved the war would be won by logistics and engineering, not just heroism. His ability to fix the machinery of war, both human and steel, changed history. He took a fleet from the bottom of a harbor to Tokyo Bay in 4 years. The man, calm as a frozen lake, had survived the greatest storm in naval history. Hit the like button if you found this breakdown of leadership insightful. Subscribe to the channel to see how logistics wins the wars that heroes start. Comment below. Do you think seniority could have won the Pacific? Share your thoughts, and we will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.